Washington, D.C.
Tonight, Trump's terms. The president scraps a planned signing of a bipartisan housing legislation demanding Congress first pass new voting requirements before a closed-door meeting with Senate GOP leaders. Trump also sitting down with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte as questions mount over his next move at home and abroad. Plus, Mamdani's machine. New York's mayor flexes his muscle inside the Democratic Party after all three of his endorsed candidates win their midterm primaries, ousting two incumbents. What the sweep says about New York politics and the future of the party. And breaking tonight, insatiable AI demand. Micron Technology, America's biggest memory chip maker, shatters Wall Street estimates with a blockbuster sales forecast. Fresh proof that the demand tied to artificial intelligence remains red hot. Bloomberg Tech's Ed Ludlow breaks down the numbers. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew.
Kaylee, we begin with a pivotal meeting tonight at the White House. It's just wrapping now with the NATO Secretary General, which followed a political food fight earlier today on Capitol Hill, a shouting match erupting during a private lunch between President Trump and Senate Republicans. We've got it all covered this evening from the Hill to the White House, where we start with Bloomberg's Jeff Mason, who right now is live on the North Lawn. Jeff, the president just now wrapping with the Secretary General at NATO. And as we see Steve Dennis joining us from Capitol Hill, we'll cover both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. But let's start at the White House. Jeff, this is just 2 weeks before an important NATO meeting in Turkey. The president with some tough rhetoric for our NATO allies and a secretary general who's trying to keep it all together. How did it go?
Political food fight is the right way to describe, I think, this entire day, Joe. The president is unhappy with a lot of people. He's unhappy with Republicans. He's unhappy with a bunch of NATO countries, and that is certainly a part of what they would have discussed today and sets up that meeting that you're referring to a couple weeks from now when he goes back to Europe. But the president putting a positive spin on how things are going with Iran and a negative spin on how people are talking about it in the hills or in the halls of Congress. Take a listen to what he said in the Oval right now.
So we're doing great in our negotiations with Iran. Right in the middle of one of the key things, which we're going to get anyway, we have breaking news. The Senate has voted that they'd like Trump to stop the war. So Iran sees that and they go, what's that all about? Now, you know it's meaningless, right? But I had lunch with them. We had 4 Republican senators and all Democrats. You know, Democrats, they want to lose the war because they're stupid.
So that sort of wraps up the president's views about how things are going with at least a few of his critics in Congress. He does have a good relationship with the head of NATO, and that was reflected in that meeting as well. But he's upset with some countries that are part of the alliance, including Spain. He was critical of Spain again in that meeting today. And I can tell you that a White House official told me recently as well that he has not given up his hopes of taking over Greenland. That is something that has also caused a great deal of tension between the United States and its European allies, and will no doubt hang over that meeting coming up in a couple weeks as well.
Well, as we consider the president's foreign policy and then the domestic agenda, like affordability, what he was focused on in Pennsylvania yesterday, which one is likely to dominate the speech he's due to give on the National Mall later this evening?
Sure. Juggling a lot of things here, as any president does, Kaylee. He had that meeting today that we were just talking about, but then his day does not end once the NATO Secretary General leaves. He is holding a rally tonight on the National Mall. The president has been pivoting at least a little bit to talking more about the economy. You rightly noted he did that in Pennsylvania yesterday, and that is all with the backdrop of the midterm elections coming up in November. I think tonight you'll likely hear him talking about the economy again and talking about what he sees as a success story of the almost first 2 years of his second term.
All right, Bloomberg's Jeff Mason live at the White House. Thank you. And joining us now on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue for more on the president's visit to the Hill today that erupted into a shouting match at one point is Bloomberg's Stephen Dennis, who's joining us from the Russell Rotunda. So, Steve, take us inside the room. How contentious was this, especially in the aftermath of the president saying he's not going to sign the housing bill into law because he wants the Save America Act passed first? Is he going to get that?
No, and I mean, it's been a very tense few weeks here in the Senate. Every time John Thune lays out a plan for the week, trying to pass the spying bill in the previous week or trying to pass the housing bill and get it signed by the president this week, the president has sort of kicked all those plans into the sun and trashed them, and including 2 hours before this signing ceremony and this lunch that had been put together by Rick Scott, one of John Thune's rivals. It really was a tense setup into this meeting, and then it did erupt into a shouting match between Trump and Bill Cassidy. It's the first face-to-face meeting between the two of them after Trump successfully defeated Bill Cassidy in his party primary. And Cassidy, of course, had voted to convict Trump in his second impeachment. So, the two of them have sort of raw emotions about each other. They ended up fighting it out behind closed doors over the Iran war after Cassidy voted the decisive vote yesterday to pass that resolution to end the war. And Trump, the way Cassidy described it is Trump asked who could possibly have voted for this thing. And Cassidy said, do you want, the real answer? And Trump said yes. And he said, well, we haven't been briefed. You said this war was going to last 4 weeks. It's lasted 4 months. None of your original aims have been met, et cetera. And it just devolved from there with Trump attacking him for having lost his seat. And it just, Cassidy basically said that, his anger and his, Irish blood got the better of him, and he kind of regretted some of it. But on the other hand, he didn't regret what he said was standing up for the American people, who he feels like have not been fully briefed by the president. The president hasn't been straight with them. So the real message, though, aside from the war, where the president felt like this vote undercut his negotiating team in the middle of negotiations and was very mad about that. He's also very mad at the Senate for not passing the Save America Act, for not gutting the filibuster, and they're not about to do that. So he kept saying, basically do whatever it takes to pass this. And, he's frustrated. They're frustrated at him. I don't think this meeting resolved anything other than letting the president blow off some steam.
All right. Let the poison out. We should note that housing bill will become law unless the president vetoes it in 10 days. Stephen Dennis, thank you so much, reporting live from Capitol Hill. Following a lot of breaking news as well after the bell, Micron Technology shattering estimates, reporting a profit increase of more than 4 times what it brought in this time last year. The tech giant reporting revenues more than $41 billion, up from $9 billion a year prior. And the stock is taken off after the close. We've got the Micron news covered for you here from coast to coast, literally, with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow joining us from our San Francisco bureau and Romaine Bostick joining us from world headquarters in New York. Ed, we'll start with you. Everyone expected Micron to knock the cover off the ball. The question was, what would be the reaction? What do you make of the answer?
Yeah, to go with the analogy, they knocked it out of the park and no one knows where the ball is anymore. The bar was really high, but essentially, Micron is in an enviable position where the product that it is now most known for is in very tight supply and astonishing demand. So the market is basically looking not just at their financial forecast for the current period, which is for revenue to grow sequentially to $50 billion, way ahead of the street's expectations, but the idea that this environment will continue for some time. Supply will remain tight throughout the next 18 months and start to improve in 2028 based on calendar years. And in any market where your product is in demand and supply is tight, that gives you pricing power. And so a big part of the focus of the ongoing calls is that did they sell more stuff or did they charge more for it? And a big feature of this market is that memory, they can price it a lot higher. It's a key component for a lot of the GPU-based architectures for data centers.
Well, so what does this mean for the other players in this space, Ed? I would imagine this is good news for more than just Micron.
Well, looking at the after-hours trading, rising tide boosts all ships, etc. The other question going into this print was about the durability of the AI trade. In other words, have we got over our skis on how this situation continues? Data centers kept getting built. Demand for the underlying products that go into a server that go inside a data center get built. And Micron, where high bandwidth memory directly corresponds proportionally to the GPU, them signaling this sort of longer term picture of the world has given a lot of confidence that all parts of the supply chain for data centers that both train and run AI models will continue to receive capital largely from the hyperscalers. That's a very feel-good environment. And it's highly analogous with what we saw in those 2022 to 2025 earnings from NVIDIA. They had astonishing growth. For in Micron's case, it's 300% top-line growth, 1,200% net income growth. The narrative that continues is really good in an environment where there is a high bar set by both the buy side and the sell side.
All right, Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, thank you. And of course, you can catch Ed every day on Bloomberg Tech right here on Bloomberg TV, just like you can catch Romain Bostic on The Close every day. So we turn now to him with our Power Move segment here on Balance of Power. So Romain, expand on what Ed was just saying about how this feeds into the broader markets and the AI-oriented narrative.
Well, this will be the big story tomorrow. Remember, we had that massive sell-off in the AI and tech space yesterday. That continued a little bit today, though. You can see on your screen there, only down about 0.1% on the S&P 500. There was just a little bit of trepidation as to what we would actually hear from Micron, but as Ed was just explaining to you there, investors got exactly what they wanted to hear. The story today, at least during the cash trading session, was more about that drop in oil prices, down about 20% so far this month. That gave a big lift, of course, to airline stocks, which have been on a tear, up about 5 straight days now. And then we saw home builders get a strong bid as well. The S&P 1500 Home Builder Index up on the day, and one of those components in there, if you flip up the board, was KB Home, which actually had its best one-day gain since 2020. That's largely because of that Road Act that did pass Congress, and that, barring something dramatic, is most likely still going to become law. This idea that we will build more homes, and so the home builders rally. KB Home, as well as D.R. Horton, that also gave a lift to companies like Home Depot, as well as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And then when you talk about risk appetite, you have a company like Wendy's, not related to the home building sector, but the meme stock mania was back, with that stock having a phenomenal day for, well, reasons, Joe and Kaylee. Don't question why, just ride with it, because that was the highlight of the day. Believe it or not, that was the second biggest stock on the day during the cash session. But tomorrow, guys, barring some dramatic turnaround here in the next few minutes, probably the best performing stocks tomorrow, they're going to be names like Micron, Qualcomm, even Corning, as well as Vertiv, that entire AI ecosystem. In fact, the triple Qs, Joe, that's the main ETF that tracks the NASDAQ 100, and after hours right now, up 1.5%.
Look at that. And the Wendy's thing was all about a Reddit post? I'm still trying to figure out that story. Romain, I've got to ask you about Bitcoin. That 59 handle earlier today, that's the lowest we've seen going back before the election. You know, there's been a lot of speculation as to what's been going on. It's basically been stuck in that around $60,000. It did drop below that today. Look, there are some people that say, Joe, that the type of people that would have been buying Bitcoin, they're buying Micron. They're buying Wendy's, for example. There is sort of this speculative aspect that Bitcoin had that, quite frankly, has just moved to other pockets of the market. And look, if you want to make a quick buck, and this isn't that's investment advice, just a read on what's been happening, people are looking to other areas, and that is coming at the expense of Bitcoin and the rest of the crypto space.
All right, Bloomberg's Romain Bostic, thank you so much. And coming up, we'll turn back to Capitol Hill and the president's scrapped signing of housing affordability legislation when Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada joins next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where the president had some choice words today when asked about his decision to delay signing the newly passed housing bill in an effort to force a vote on the Save America Act. After posting earlier today on social media saying the issue was a, quote, national emergency, he talked about it as well. Listen.
We have rigged elections. Now, in my case, I made it too big to rig. Remember the expression, too big to rig? But we have rigged and we have to have voter ID. If we don't have voter ID and proof of citizenship, but basically it's the Save America Act. Everybody wants it. Everybody is it, including Democrats. 87% of Democrats want it. Not the leaders, because they want to cheat. Their policy is so bad, they're unelectable.
Joining us now to get into this and a lot more is Democratic Senator Cortez Masto of Nevada, a member of the Senate Banking and Finance Committees. And Senator, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. When the president emerged with John Thune in the Senate a short time ago, he was asked by reporters about this decision. We've never heard of a signing ceremony being canceled after the Sharpies were set and the cameras were fixed, the crowd was in place. And he suggested that the Save America Act is more of an urgent matter than dealing with the housing crisis. Few people need to look further than Nevada to understand what the housing market is facing. You have approximately 1/4 of the homes in the Las Vegas area owned by corporate investors. Which one's more urgent for you?
Well, first of all, Joe and Kayleigh, thank you. It's always great to talk with you. And it's clear what the president's prioritizing right now. He's prioritizing himself, his ego, his own, this election. He has concerns about Democrats taking control because of his bad policies. Those bad policies are playing out in Nevada right now. It is true that many Nevadans are suffering because of the housing crisis, because of high gas costs, because of grocery costs, healthcare costs. You just have to talk to people in Nevada. And it doesn't matter your party, Democrat, Republican, nonpartisan, you see it. And the other piece that people forget about Nevada is most of our economy is generated on tourism. And tourism and travel is down because of the bad policies of this administration. 7.5% are down. And that's the main revenue generator for Nevada. And it's $1 trillion industry for this country. So this administration, their policies are bad. Here's what I do know, and I sit on Senate Banking and Housing Committee. I worked with my colleagues in a bipartisan way to get this bill done. It passed out of the Senate unanimously. Joe, when's the last time you've seen anything pass out of the Senate in a bipartisan way unanimously, right? We passed it. We got it done in the House. It was ready to go. Why? Because it brings affordable housing to so many across this country, including in Nevada. It addresses workforce housing, it addresses low-income issues, it addresses manufacturing. It brings more funding into community block grant programs that help fund the supply of housing in Nevada. It addresses housing in urban areas, in rural areas, in our tribal areas, manufactured home communities. I mean, there's so much that is a positive for not only Nevadans, but so many Americans across this country. And why is the president refusing to sign this bipartisan bicameral bill? Because he wants to pass and rig the election himself by getting this Save America bill passed.
Well, Senator, the president says he considers getting the Save America Act passed to be a national emergency. What is your interpretation of that language? What could the president potentially have leeway to do if he were to say that this is a national emergency around the election?
Well, first of all, how many times has he used that language, national emergency, to benefit himself or get his own policies done that have hurt this country? He used that to do blanket tariffs. And we all know those blanket tariffs, how it has impacted our economy and our small businesses in a negative way. He uses a national emergency as an excuse to bypass Congress, to try to get things done that only benefit him. And let me talk about the Save America Act. By the way, they've tried to pass this before, and not just Democrats, but there were 4 Republicans who are opposed to this. Because this bill is not a voter ID bill. This bill will disenfranchise voters across the country. This will actually give the voter rolls of states, including like Nevada, to the Department of Homeland Security, to the federal government, and they get to decide who eligible voters are. And they will kick people off the voter rolls who have been voting, who are U.S. citizens, who have been voting, and it'll make it very difficult for them to re-register to vote. Because you have to do it in person, you have to have either your birth certificate or a passport. And let me put a finer print on this. In Nevada, many people have a real ID. That's not going to be enough to be able to vote under the Save America Act. So this is a voter disenfranchisement because Donald Trump knows his policies that we have just talked about, his high costs, the affordability issue that many, many Americans are dealing with, they're being harmed by it. And they're going to come out and they're going to vote against him. And that's the last thing that Donald Trump wants.
Well, I mean, we also know that, as according to the Senate leader, the votes aren't there for the Save America Act. So we're spending a lot of time talking about something that will likely never see the light of day. One thing I think you can agree in the light of day, though, Senator, is high gas prices. I took a look just now at the state of Nevada. You're at $4.72, which is well above the national average when we consider the issue of affordability. The president was talking a short time ago in the Oval Office about investigating oil companies for price gouging. He named Exxon, Chevron, Shell, and BP, saying gas prices should be $2.25 right now. Bloomberg Intelligence reminds us that big oil no longer operates gas stations. The retail side is a different operation, Senator. Would you support a price gouging investigation like this if it meant lower gas prices?
Well, first of all, let me just say, as a former AG, I supported it and worked on legislation just like that. And as a senator, of course I support and talked about it and support the legislation here at a federal level. That's not what Donald Trump's talking about. Donald Trump knows that his war of choice with Iran is the reason why we're seeing these high prices. He knows the Strait of Hormuz. What is happening there has caused the increase. And in Nevada, let me just say, I was home a couple of weeks ago, and I filled up my gas tank. It was $5. It was $5 a gallon. And I can rest assured, if you're in northern Nevada, it's going to be much more than that. And if you need diesel, it's going to add another $1 to that. So think about this. We are trying to make sure that we're lowering costs for families so that they can get to work. But if they can't fill up their gas tank, it's going to be harder for them to get to work. And then they're going to have to make choices. Whether they fill up the gas tank, they need a job, how do they pay for their health care, how do they pay for the groceries, how do they pay for their energy costs? My Nevada families are struggling right now with those very issues. It'd be very easy for us to address some of them by just undoing the bad policies of this administration. But he keeps leaning into it. And Joe and Kaylee, you know he has said this. He has basically said he does not care about those challenges that the American public are facing right now with the high costs. He has said it. So we know what he values. And it was shown again today when he refused to sign the 21st Century Road to Housing bill because he wants to try to now push through the Save America Act, which rigs the elections to his benefit.
As we consider elections, Senator, in our final moment with you, we obviously saw some primaries in New York yesterday that Republicans have seized on as showing Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic Socialist, as being a greater force within the party. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, went as far today as to say that he is now the leader of the Democratic Party. And I wonder how you would respond to that.
That's not true in Nevada. Listen, Nevada politics and demographics and voters are different, as you well know, than New York voters. I come from a swing state. We are beautifully diverse, but that means we also have Republicans, Democrats, and nonpartisans. And it is a swing state. That means you have to appeal to everyone. It is not a true blue state. It is a state where everybody comes together, works together, finds common ground, works to get things done on behalf of everyone. And that means you got to work with everyone, and you got to work across party lines.
All right, Senator, we appreciate you joining this on the issues impacting Nevada. Democratic Senator Cortez Masto of Nevada. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And still ahead here, as we were just mentioning, it was a pretty good primary night for New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani in New York. We'll have more when our political panel joins us up next to dissect the results. Is this unique to New York and not other states like Nevada, as the senator was suggesting, or does this signal something directionally for the way in which the party is moving ahead of the midterms? We'll get into that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Big scoop flashed across the terminal just a short time ago regarding Anthropic. Here it is. Bloomberg exclusively reporting the AI giant had accused Chinese tech behemoth Alibaba of orchestrating a large-scale effort to, quote, illicitly access its Clout AI agent. Bloomberg's Maggie Eastland reporting Alibaba, quote, used thousands of fraudulent accounts that undermine the U.S. AI developer's decision to keep its products out of China. Anthropic claiming a campaign by Alibaba's own AI lab targeted Claude's most prized capabilities. A fast-moving story this evening with global implications, and we're lucky to have Bloomberg's Mike Shepard on hand to break it all down. Another doozy of a development regarding Anthropic. Mike, how's this going to go over with the administration?
Well, that's one of the questions we raise in the piece. But honestly, Joe, we don't really have an answer. We don't know how quickly they will embrace Anthropic's side of the story, given just that the company and the government are at such odds right now. There's the long-running fight with the Pentagon over safety guardrails that the company wanted in place for military use of its technology. And now there's the more recent spat that it has had with the administration over export controls that the Commerce Department just imposed on its top two products. At the same time, this is an issue in particular, though, that the administration has looked into, and that is the question of whether Chinese AI developers are piggybacking on the results generated by American AI models and then using that data to generate their own rival chatbots, all at a fraction of the cost. And that's something that is posing a huge challenge to developers like Anthropic and like OpenAI that are looking to go public later this year, but have also sunk billions upon billions of dollars into hard physical infrastructure and are planning to spend a lot more.
Well, and as they spend on infrastructure, we also have a huge question around how much they're willing to spend to influence regulation and policy, how active AI money is going to be in these midterms. We got a little taste of that in the New York primary yesterday. Mike, what did we learn?
Well, we sure did. And we saw that the AI billionaires led by Greg Brockman of OpenAI and Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz, that they managed to prevail in New York 12. And this race was considered to be a bellwether for the AI issue. And it involved a New York State Assemblyman named Alex Borres, who had backed, while in the state legislature, a key piece of legislation that would have imposed tougher safety restrictions and security guardrails on AI technology. Now, that measure was fought tooth and nail by the industry, and they looked at his candidacy to succeed the retiring Gerald Nadler as a way to maybe ensure that nobody else in Congress got the same idea, and they really wanted to derail his candidacy. The last thing that the industry saw as necessary for them was to have somebody like Alex Borres roaming the halls of Congress. So there was a ton of spending, Kaylee, a total of $29 million on this race just from tech interests. Now, the interesting thing, though, was that some of the money came from the Leading the Future PAC that was backed by Greg Brockman and Mark Andreessen, but a lot of other money came from Anthropic and safety-minded AI groups in support of Alex Borres. Nonetheless, he ended up losing to Michael Lasher, as we know, a candidate who was backed by Michael Bloomberg, the founder of Bloomberg LP, the parent of this network. But nonetheless, for Alex Borres and for those who are favoring a safety-minded approach to AI, the election was a negative bellwether in a way, and it certainly loomed positive for the industry in its effort to try to elect candidates who will maybe take a softer touch when it comes to AI regulation.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, thank you so much, as always. And outside of the 12th district, which Mike was just talking about, establishment Democrats in New York are picking up the pieces today following a string of primary losses, leading one publication to declare, quote, Democratic Socialists are coming for 2028. This is after New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani went 3 for 3 last night with his backed progressive candidates beating Democratic incumbent Congressman Espaillat and Goldman and a handpicked successor, Antonio Reynoso, to usher in a new wave of Democrats in the city. The wins also leading the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to declare Mamdani the, quote, leader of the Democratic Party. Joining us now for more on that is our political panel, Ashley Davis, Republican strategist and partner at S3 Group, and Jim Kessler, Democratic strategist and executive vice president at Third Way. Well, welcome to you both. Very glad to have you. And Jim, I am very glad to have your reaction to what went down in New York yesterday. Are those things true? Are Democratic Socialists and Zohran Mamdani taking over the party?
Well, they're taking over the party in New York City, that's for sure. But, you know, I've got news for the world. New York City is not the center of the universe. It's not the center of America. It's not the center of the Democratic Party. And when Democrats win, it's because they're winning in places other than New York City. So congratulations, Democratic Socialists of America. My warning for Democrats writ large is if Mamdani and Chevalier and some of the other folks who won become the face of the Democratic Party, we're cooked. Game over.
So you don't see the mayor of New York, Mamdani, as the leader of the Democratic Party today, as many declared, including the Treasury Secretary.
The Treasury Secretary is a Republican who wants Republicans to win and would love to make Zohran Mamdani the leader of the Democratic Party.
You know what else he said, though? He said it's not just New York. What's going on in Maine, Ashley? What's going on in Michigan, California? You can connect these dots.
Well, what's going on right here?
Okay.
I mean, if you see what happened with the mayoral race, but not just the mayoral race, we had 3 city council members that won as well that were the same progressive chops as she has. I mean, so I actually think that actually concerns me. I'm a huge fan of the current mayor. I think she's done a really good job in Washington trying to like split the baby and things that she had to care for. But I do agree with you. I mean, this isn't the Democratic Party. Obviously, Scott Bessent wants it to be the Democratic Party. I would like it to be the Democratic Party, but it's probably not the Democratic Party. But here's what I think is very interesting. Is this just an anti-establishment message, an anti-establishment vote more than anything else? I mean, we saw this with the Tea Party. We saw this almost, you can even say, with MAGA in a way, that it's everybody but the people that are in control right now. And obviously, these 3 are going to be Congress members because they they're in deep blue seats. But what happens for some of the progressive candidates that have won in Maine and other places that have real Republican challengers?
Well, so there's a question of what this all means for Democrats' ability to retake the majority. It also raises questions about how hard it's going to be to govern in that majority. Hakeem Jeffries did not get his winners last night. He's going to have to deal with these members if he becomes Speaker.
Right. And look, I think Democrats are going to win the House majority. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a Democrat. I mean, I just think that's going to happen. But if they only get the majority by 3 or 4 votes, these new members are a problem. If they get it by 10 or 12 votes, these members are not a problem. What Jeffries understands and what Pelosi understood is the majority comes through the moderates, the people in tough districts, and they're going to have to accommodate those folks. So Jeffries knows that. Most Democrats know that, but there's a few new squad members who I think don't.
I mean, is this the Marjorie Taylor Greene of our party? Is it the Massey of our party, as we were talking about earlier? I mean, if you only have 3 votes, which with redistricting could actually happen if the House flips, I mean, is that Jeffries is going to have a hard time? I always have said that Nancy Pelosi is the best manager I've ever seen in regards to a speaker. She's done an amazing job. Can Jeffries do that? He's never been a speaker.
Can we ask you about what happened in that meeting today with Senate Republicans? I know you were not in there.
No, I know. I thought you were going to ask me about the housing
shouting
bill
with the president. Well, guess what? The housing bill didn't get signed today. So how do you put this all together in what appears to be an angry president, but angry with people inside the family?
Well, and also you see that the inside of the family that are able to talk freely, besides maybe Murkowski and Collins, are the ones that don't have to run again.
His careers
right?
have ended.
Yes, and well, except for maybe Tillis.
Yeah, okay.
But no, I think it was a tough discussion. I think more importantly, the conversation was about Iran more than it was about the SAVE Act, which was the voting act that everyone's been talking about, which I thought it was because of the housing bill being delayed. Yeah. I really thought that was going to be the main point, and then he was going to come out of this meeting and maybe say, we have a path forward for passing the housing bill. Obviously, that didn't happen, but it was all about Iran. And actually, the people that voted against him yesterday in regards to the War Powers Act, I mean, he was mad.
He was.
Yeah, and Cassidy was mad.
Yes, apparently had to be encouraged to pull back a little bit.
Restrained by John
He obviously got a lot of frustration.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and on the notion that the housing bill and the Save America Act did not feature as heavily as we might have thought, given the events earlier in the day, what is your read on that? This was bipartisan legislation. Massive majorities in both the House and Senate passed this bill, and now the president is effectively holding it hostage. I just wonder if you think he really is willing to let this not go forward in a midterm year where there are vulnerable incumbents.
Sure, he's willing to let it not go forward. Absolutely. Look, he wasn't angry. He had a tantrum, okay? And he's had a tantrum because this is the reason why people have tantrums in general. They can't accept the responsibility that the reason they're in this predicament they're in is their own fault. So he mishandled Iran, he's mishandled the Senate. And he has now permanent enemies in the Senate for the rest of this Congress on the Republican side, because instead of helping those who are running for re-election, he hurt them. And those people want to exact vengeance, just the way Trump wants to exact vengeance. Eventually, I think this housing bill will get done, because in some ways, cooler heads will prevail. But he's looking out for himself and soothing his own anger rather than looking out what's best for the country. That's the way he is. We've seen it for 6 years.
How much room does the president get from his own caucus in the Senate, specifically when it comes to Iran? And I mentioned this, you might not believe who's walking to our tent right now on the North Lawn, but the Secretary General of NATO, who just came from the Oval Office with the president, is going to join us momentarily. With that said, does the president get 60 days of space to cut a deal?
Yes, but also, I mean, they have to define what's at war. I mean, right now we're at a ceasefire, so it's not really at war. I actually think the war powers vote yesterday was more symbolic than it is anything. I don't think the president is going to start putting troops on the ground or declaring war or anything like that on Iran. I think that goes away. But going back to housing, what we need to watch is the speaker has not signed the bill yet, because he was going to sign that today before the president signed it at noon. That did not happen. As soon as he signs it and sends it to the White House officially, the president has 10 days. And so, and if he doesn't sign it, it becomes law. I don't think, I mean, we don't know what we don't know, that he would ever let this hugely bipartisan bill that helps people with the housing crisis around the country actually falter. But he's holding it hostage because it's a negotiating tactic.
So we could have a ceremony yet, it sounds like. Our panel is going to stay with us, Ashley Davis and Jim Kessler, as we turn now, as I mentioned, following his meeting moments ago in the Oval Office with President Trump, is NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte. Mr. Secretary General, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It means a lot to us to take your time on what I know is a very busy day. Absolutely. We saw you in there. We were watching the whole back and forth with yourself, the president, and a gaggle of reporters in the Oval Office. You had everything from whiteboards to stats to make the argument to President Trump. Did you manage to soften some of the edges when it comes to Trump and the alliance?
Well, I mean, what I think is important is to be fair, and fairness dictates that this president is really doing a huge amount of work to get NATO in better shape. He had a big success last year in The Hague with the 5% spending commitment. But what I wanted to show to him tonight is that over the last 10 years, since Trump 45 and now Trump 47, we see this staggering increase on European and Canadian ally spending more, but also when it comes to the year-on-year increase, Trump 47 in 2025, almost 20% more spending, which is, of course, because of Russia and the threat and the war in Ukraine, but also very much because this president is quite forcefully encouraging allies to spend more. And I think it is fair to share that with him.
Well, and Mr. Secretary General, it's not just the president, it's others in his administration as well. The Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said in Brussels recently that the U.S. would stop paying NATO dues if the allies don't meet defense spending targets. In your understanding, is this just the long-term 5% target that matters, or has this administration set out to you that there needs to be more interim goals met in the short term?
Well, what we are seeing already with the almost 20% increase, that you are reaching the max in terms of absorption capacity. You can only each year on year spend so much more because you have to find and hire and contract the men and women in uniform, and obviously you have to work very hard, and the US is doing that, Europe is doing that, on expanding the output of the defense industrial base, which at the moment, on both sides of the Atlantic, is simply not producing enough. So the president is now meeting with the bosses of the big defense industrial companies in the United States to again make that argument. But then, given that background, spending almost 20% more means that he not only got the promise in The Hague, but that allies are now delivering. Take Germany spending twice as much in 2029 than they did in 2021. More than 150 billion by 2029. These are really big numbers and a great success.
I want to ask you about Ukraine. Secretary General, and what you heard from President Trump today, it was shocking for a lot of people to see massive black clouds of smoke pluming over St. Petersburg. We know that Ukraine is reaching deeper into Russian territory and making remarkable use of its advanced drone technology. Does President Trump believe Ukraine can win this war militarily?
Well, let me not speak for President Trump, because I think he should do that himself. But obviously we discussed Ukraine. And you heard this also in the public part of the meeting with the media in the Oval Office, that he acknowledged that Ukraine is doing well on the battlefield, is doing well in terms of hitting some of the critical infrastructure in Russia. I really think that over the last 3 to 6 months, Ukraine is doing much better. And when you look at the amount of Russians getting killed or seriously wounded, we are now reaching numbers of 30 to 35,000. When you look at the war in Vietnam, in 14 years, the United States lost, Russia is now losing in 5 weeks what the United States lost in 14 years in Vietnam. Russia is losing now in 3 weeks what the Russians lost in 10 years in Afghanistan in the 1980s. These are staggering numbers. So, as you saw in the public part of the meeting, the President very much acknowledging the fact that the Ukrainians are doing so much better. Also thanks to US support, which is there, paid for by the European and Canadian allies, and other key help the US is providing.
Well, as we consider what Ukraine has been able to accomplish in the longer-range strikes we are seeing into Russian territory, Secretary General, have any of the NATO allies expressed some concern about that, the idea that it could spark further Russian retaliation and enrope NATO countries into it?
Well, I think we should start by seeing what happened in 2022. By the way, in 2014, when they grabbed Crimea, and then in February 2022, when they started the full onslaught on Ukraine. This was unprovoked. There was absolutely no reason for the Russians to do this. So it's only fair for Ukraine to be able to defend itself. And they do this with help from the West. But also because of their own ingenuity. They are extremely successful in constantly updating the drone technology and the anti-drone technology, staying ahead of the Russians, and therefore really being successful on the battlefield.
You know, it's really something. We watched you very closely in the Oval Office today, Secretary General. This went on for quite some time, and it was not your first visit, of course, with President Trump. Do you have the playbook now? Did you cook up the recipe? You show up with the goods, a whiteboard, the stats, and a story that the president wants to hear, and you might be able to advance your cause.
You know, what I believe is to be fair when leadership is successful. His leadership is successful, and what I wanted to show today is it is successful in 3 ways. 1, on Iran, degrading the nuclear capability. 2, on NATO. Not only getting the allies to deliver, to commit to 5% defense spending, but also to deliver on the spending. And that's clearly what is happening at the moment. And 3rd, by taking that code, that mantle of being the leader of the free world. And when he meets in Ankara, he will meet with all the allies, but also 10 countries there as guests from the Middle East, from the Indo-Pacific. A total combined GDP of $70 trillion, 2.5 the size of the United States. Absolutely there to hear his views, to get his thoughts on the next steps we collectively have to take.
Well, of course, the financial aspect of this and the investments into the defense industrial base are one part of it, Mr. Secretary General, but there's also the consideration of actual human capital and U.S. military forces that are currently stationed all around Europe. Obviously, we've now seen withdrawals and considerations that this administration is making about moving troops around further. How do you avoid anything being chaotic in nature as that plays out, and how does Europe make sure that it's able to adequately defend itself in a surprise scenario? What are those preparations like?
I think the United States is doing that. So let's first agree that the United States has to take care of multiple theaters, not only Europe, also, for example, the Indo-Pacific. And if a situation would occur where they have to defend both sides of the equation, both the Indo-Pacific and Europe, they have to avoid a situation in which they have spread their resources too thinly. This is why Europeans have to step up. This is NATO 3.0, a stronger Europe and a stronger NATO. That means that the US will stay involved when it comes to the nuclear umbrella, but also when it comes to the conventional. But over time, what you now will see, and this is a structured process, is that the Europeans are taking over more and more of that leadership role. For example, when it comes to the 3 combatant commands, they will, over the next 18 to 24 months, move from American generals and admirals to European generals and admirals. So that's also an example of Europeans stepping up. But also when it comes to Ukraine, the fact that the US is still providing all the support, but paid for by Europeans and Canada, which is only fair. So Europe stepping up, the US staying heavily involved when it comes to the conventional nuclear deterrence in Europe.
The President's had a lot to say about NATO's lack of involvement in the Strait of Hormuz. Did that come up today? Did he have a message for you on this, or is he moving on?
No, yeah, you've seen this in the public part, and I know there is disappointment. And the point I wanted to make is that the disappointment has to do with a couple of isolated cases. Yes, they are there. I understand the disappointment, but when you look at the overall picture of European nations living up to their bilateral basing agreements with the United States. So this is not NATO; these are bilateral agreements, but obviously they are all allies. When you look at that, what you see is between the end of February, when the war started on the 28th of February, until the ceasefire mid-April, that between 4,000 and 5,000 US planes taking off from European bases. This is Europe as one big power projection platform for the United States.
Did the President know that before you told him?
I guess so, yes. He knows all these numbers, but I think it is fair to also point out to that fact.
Yeah.
Well, as we consider the different facts and figures here, Mr. Secretary General, when we consider the actual articles that bind together the NATO alliance, including Article 5. I know before you came over to speak with us, you were speaking with a number of reporters, and you told them that you are absolutely certain that the U.S. would protect Europe if necessary. Is that just a certainty that you feel the U.S. would abide by Article 5, or did the president say that to you directly? Did he verbally reaffirm that commitment?
I will never, in my role as Secretary General, disclose what we discuss between closed doors. But let me say this. Article 5 is there to protect the whole of the alliance. And the US is not only involved in NATO to protect Europe. NATO is also there to protect the United States. You have seen Jonas Støre, the Prime Minister of Norway, visiting the White House in April last year and showing those charts with these huge Russian nuclear submarines just over the border from Norway in these big Russian ports. And he explained to the president, these submarines are not there to attack Norway, they are there to attack the United States. And to prevent these submarines to become a threat to the United States, we have the alliance working together, making sure that these submarines are not capable of reaching the shores on this side of the Atlantic. And then when it comes to Europe as such, the fact that the US is so heavily involved in Europe also gives the United States the ability to do long-range strikes, the ability to control critical choke points, the ability to have industrial depth when it comes to defense industrial production. So there are many reasons why the US is involved, not only to protect Europe, but also because the defense of the US mainland is involved here.
The President had some nice things to say about Turkey and President Erdogan in the Oval Office today. And of course, we had pretty big news. It was a market-moving headline. The President announcing he's sending more engines, aircraft engines, to Turkey, despite objections from some in Congress. Secretary General, is this the right move right now?
I never comment about these bilateral decisions. So that you have to understand, when there are discussions between allies, you will see me going mute and then trying to help behind the scenes when decisions are being made between allies when it comes to specific defense industrial decisions. I'm always staying out of that, of course, taking note. For me, one thing is crucial, keeping the alliance together, making sure we are as strong as possible, and the United States is providing the leadership and the defense industrial output and the encouragement to make sure we stay strong.
Well, and understanding your reluctance to talk about specific defense systems between countries, can you shed some light as to whether there is a conversation happening amongst all of the allies about increasing the supply of Patriots specifically? What is the nature of those conversations?
Well, that's a crucial conversation because the Patriot missiles, the PAC-3 missiles, are crucial when it comes to the Patriot systems to be maximum effective, obviously. And what we are seeing at the moment is that Ukraine needs them to protect their cities, to protect their critical infrastructure. The Russians are not able to advance on the front line. They are losing a lot of Russians, as we discussed already in this interview. But obviously there is still the threat from Russia when it comes to cities and the critical infrastructure in Ukraine. So that's one reason why we need to ramp up Patriot missile production. There is close cooperation between companies in the United States and companies in Europe to help with that production. So a lot is going on. I guess the meeting the president is now having with the big defense industrial companies will also partly be about the Patriots. But also the other defense industrial output of the United States. So, yes, this is absolutely being discussed, and it is very important.
This is what you need most now, the interceptors for Patriots, THAADs. Are there others, Secretary?
Of course, we also need long-range ammunition. We need everything to ramp up the production of everything. The good news is that our stockpiles are in a good position, so we can defend ourselves. But with the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, obviously we have to make sure that we keep that production going. And with all the money coming in, there is also from a purely commercial perspective for defense industrial companies every reason to ramp up production because the demand is there and the money is there, both in the US and in Europe and Canada.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, we thank you so much, Secretary General. We'd love to follow up after the summit in Ankara. Thank you for being so generous with your time. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lyons in Washington. We want to get back to the panel here for their take on everything that we just heard. Republican strategist Ashley Davis, Democratic strategist Jim Kessler. Jim, I'll start with you here. Pretty remarkable following this back and forth in the Oval Office. He was so careful with his comments. Do we call this visit a success?
I think we do, and let's give credit to the Secretary General. Bravo, this is so important.
Yeah.
We're rooting for you. Look, Donald Trump, you know, he had the meeting with Zelensky. It went bad, that first meeting, and you don't have the cards that moment. The reason why that moment is so important is that Donald Trump never likes to admit that he's wrong. So what the Secretary General was doing in this case was showing all the ways that Donald Trump has been right over the years so that Donald Trump can ease into the position of like a full commitment to Ukraine, which we have not done. The idea that we're discussing getting, you know, whether they should get Patriot missiles, like, are you kidding me? This is an existential moment for the United States and Europe. Like, do it. Like, the edge is with us now. Let's press the advantage.
Well, do you expect we will, Ashley?
Well, listen, I think that his demeanor is unbelievable, and I think he's a great negotiator and a great leader. But I also think that we are supporting Ukraine. We're just supporting it in a different way. And I think that you saw that initial horrible meeting with Zelensky. But now we are supplying a lot of these weapons and a lot of these things that they need and the ammunition. We're just not paying for everything
by way
anymore.
of Europe,
By way of Europe. And I 100% support that. We were just writing check after check after check without some of these other countries stepping up. And I think that there is a quiet balance of what the president's doing, which is what he was kind of alluding to.
There's also the question, though, of political support. The president saying openly, I believe Ukraine can win this war. Will we ever hear that?
I mean, we should hear that because Putin needs a signal that the United States under Donald Trump is not secretly on his side. Like, we need something here that starts moving towards the end of this conflict. And I think Putin has found comfort in everything Trump has done from the inauguration on forward. And yeah, I mean, we are still supplying things, and I think it's right that Europe's paying for it, but like, everything is a fight. And the idea that Patriot missiles, like, they're not there right now.
It's quite a commodity.
It's like, come on, let's go.
But I think we've learned so much from Ukraine in regards to our war fighting. And I think that even in Iran, that what's moving forward. But I also think that Russia, all the coup conversations that are happening, I think that he really is being weakened.
All right, we'll leave it on that note. Ashley Davis and Jim Kessler, thank you both so much for joining us on Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.